Welcome back to Sleepy History Tales, where the forgotten past whispers its darkest secrets. Tonight we'll walk you through a story that once heard will not easily leave you. It's a tale about family, but not the kind you're thinking of. This is the haunting legacy of the Winslow Institute, a secluded orphanage in rural Pennsylvania. From 1907 to 1946, over 3,000 children were taken in. Nearly all vanished. No graves, no records, no explanations. And it all begins not in a history book, but with a building that shouldn't exist. There were no permits, no newspaper mentions, no closing notices. The place was never formally opened and never officially shut down. And yet, in the sticky summer heat of 1996, a storm uprooted centuries-old pines in the heart of Elk County, revealing a decaying structure long swallowed by the forest. A place the wind had tried to forget. Its windows were blacked out, the roof half sunken like it had been caving in for years. And then came the sign, bent iron still clinging to the front gate, Winslow Institute for Foundling Children. A name no one, no historian, no local, no record keeper had ever heard before. The man who found it, Dale Morgan, was a county surveyor. He wasn't looking for ghosts, but what he found would become one of the darkest child welfare investigations in American history. The rooms inside told a story all on their own. Rows of tiny, rusted hospital beds, cold metal cribs stacked like cages, a corridor so long it seemed to vanish into the trees beyond, and hooks. Dozens of surgical hooks still embedded in the pale green ceiling. Then they found the door. It was sealed, bolted, reinforced with thick iron hinges and hidden beneath a layer of rotting floorboards. Behind it, a sub-level chamber, windowless, silent, sterile. A surgical room. But why would an orphanage need an operating theater? That question would be answered, slowly, horrifically. Tucked behind a loose brick in the chamber wall, investigators uncovered a small leather-bound journal, stained with time and wrapped tightly in gauze. The name on the first page, Sarah Ara Mitchell Nurse. Her entries would unravel everything. The story the Winslows buried. Before we open Sarah's journal and follow her into the shadows, let me ask you something. Most people don't stay for stories like this. They look away. They click away. But if you're still here, maybe you're different. Maybe you understand that some truths are too important to forget, no matter how chilling they are. So if you're ready to explore what others tried to erase, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. And let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? The UK, Canada. Maybe, just maybe, not far from Elk County itself. Let's keep going. Sarah's journal didn't just reveal what happened inside those walls. It screamed it. She wrote of sick children, tiny bodies burning with fever, infants that disappeared after being sent to something called the observation wing, and experiments clinical, calculated, ordered by a man she referred to only as Dr. A. The Winslow name appeared again and again, but never in warning, only in power. The journal smelled of antiseptic and mildew. Its pages had fused together from damp and age. It felt more like a relic than a record. But when they finally peeled it open, what they read didn't sound like a nurse's notes. It read like a confession. March 12th, 1927. His name was Thomas, 4 years old, One green eye clouded since birth. Never cried. That made him useful to them. Sarah Mitchell was just 22 when she arrived. Fresh out of nursing school in Philadelphia, she thought she'd found a career stable Noble needed. But what she walked into wasn't an orphanage. It was a clinic, a facility. She described children arriving in trucks labeled as donations, some sedated, some simply terrified. No playgrounds, no teachers, no bedtime stories, just cold concrete medical charts and barred windows. She was assigned to Wing C, a remote section of the building. It had no heat and books were forbidden unless they were medical. Children weren't taught, they were watched, observed, altered. And so, the question deepened. What was the Winslow Institute really for? The halls of the Winslow Institute, according to Sarah Mitchell's journal, were filled with silence, but not the kind that soothes. It was the low hum of unseen machines, the shuffle of restrained feet across tile floors, and the constant whisper of a voice that never raised itself above a murmur. Dr. A's voice, calm, measured, cruel. But one journal entry stood apart. April 3rd, 1927. A Dr. A instructed us not to name them anymore. They are subjects, not sons. He said names confuse us. That's when I stopped praying. That entry chilled the forensic team, not because of what it said, but because of how it was written. The handwriting shifted, slanted, urgent. Lines were scrawled with such force they tore through the paper. Some sentences were crossed out in thick black ink. Others underlined in what would later test positive for dried human blood. Sarah had tried in every way to make a record dosages, dates, procedures, rooms, but always missing were surnames, birthplaces, next of kin. The children had no paper trails, no legal entries. They had simply stopped existing. As the pages turned, the entries grew more frantic. May 19th. I tried to take Mary out. They caught me. Said if I made trouble, I'd end up like the others. I'm the last one left. Sarah wasn't just witnessing horror. She was documenting a system of vanishing. She hinted at something deeper. An underground operation, one funded by unnamed donors and shielded by status. She referred to benefactors, to visits by special guests, and to something she called only the Red Room trials. What happened in those rooms she never described, only implied. But then came her final message. June 7th. I've hidden this book behind the East Wing's vent. If someone finds it, please don't forget them. Don't let them be buried twice. That single entry confirmed what investigators feared most. This wasn't failure. It was design. The Winslow Institute wasn't an orphanage. It was a mechanism of disappearance. But not all stories end where they begin. Some survive buried in time, waiting to be heard. In this case, survival had a name. Thomas, a child mentioned briefly in Sarah's notes. 4 years old. Quiet. One eye clouded from birth. A boy too silent to be noticed. Or so they thought. He wasn't just a scribble in a crumbling diary. He was real. In 1972, almost 45 years after Sarah wrote his name, a man named Thomas Caldwell saw a local news segment on abandoned medical facilities in upstate New York. The footage was brief, just a crumbling facade long forgotten. But when the image of the building flashed across the screen, Caldwell froze. His wife later said he began to tremble. Then whispered, "They kept us underground." Reporters didn't take him seriously at first. Just an aging mechanic from a small Pennsylvania town. No criminal record. No history of delusions. But then, he started naming things no one else could possibly know. He described the ventilation layout in the East Wing. He drew from memory the strange symbol carved into the boiler room's iron door, a symbol that matched Sarah's sketch in the journal. 1 year later, in 1973, Caldwell returned to the site with forensic teams. He led them unprompted behind what had once been the records room. There they found a sealed stairwell. It wasn't on any blueprint, not even the original construction documents. It descended 4 stories underground. Down there were rusted gurneys, surgical harnesses still bolted to the concrete walls, and long metal drawers labeled not with names but numbers. Caldwell didn't flinch. Instead, he began pointing. That's where they took the quiet ones. That one, the girl lost her voice there. And that room, they called it the listening post. They told us the walls could hear us scream. When asked how he escaped, Caldwell fell silent. And then, through tears, he told them Sarah. She had dressed him in an orderly's coat during a fire drill. He had been 7. He remembered her holding his hand. He remembered her crying. He remembered the heavy scent of ether, a man with no eyebrows, who spoke German and carried a dog leash. But most of all, he remembered what that man said to him. Words Caldwell would carry in his bones for the rest of his life. Your parents sold you. Some stories don't need embellishment. Some names don't need last names to be remembered. Thomas lived. And because he did so, did the truth. But what about the others? What about Mary, the girl who lost her voice? The ones who never even made it into a journal. Don't worry. We're not done yet. Not even close. That makes you ours. Those were the last words Thomas Caldwell remembered before everything went black. Words etched into his mind deeper than the basement walls he'd lived beneath. Later doctors would diagnose him with complex PTSD, a condition shaped by long-term sustained trauma. But no diagnosis could explain how Caldwell knew what he knew. The East Wing's ductwork, the hidden stairwell, the etched symbol no historian could trace. The listening post. He hadn't just remembered. He'd spent a lifetime trying to forget and failed. To outsiders, the Winslow Institute was filed away as a sad relic of a bygone era, an orphanage run under harsh conditions, marred by poor oversight, inadequate resources, and obsolete medical care. A tragedy, but an ordinary one. Easier to swallow, easier to ignore. But what if it wasn't incompetence? What if no one ever investigated because they weren't supposed to? By 1910, the Winslows were no longer just caretakers, they were gatekeepers of silence. Henry Winslow Sr., once an obscure philanthropist, was now dining with mayors, judges, even state legislators. He appeared in newspapers, smiling beside sick children with a hand over his heart and a ribbon on his lapel. But inside the institute, he was moving something else. Children, money, influence, and no one asked questions. Sarah Mitchell had sensed it early on. One entry described the arrival of 3 men in expensive overcoats. They didn't ask about the children, only the inventory. She wrote, Mr. Winslow told me never to speak when the dark car arrives. He says they're donors. But why do they only ask for the ones without papers? Then came the money. By 1911, over 60 children were in residence. Yet no financial records existed, no payroll, no audits, no inspections. And still, the institute expanded. It bought up neighboring properties, installed surgical suites that rivaled hospitals. And in 1937, at the height of the Great Depression, Henry Winslow Jr. was photographed cutting the ribbon on a new pediatric wing, flanked by a smiling city councilman and 2 uniformed officers. The optics were perfect. The machinery beneath rotten. Years later, one investigator would ask the question. No one dared to speak aloud. What exactly were they funding? And where were those children actually going? The Caldwell testimony reopened wounds that had never healed and doors that were never meant to be unlocked. That same year, a retired court clerk named Dolores Kent came forward. She had filed over a dozen expedited adoptions between 1920 and 1935, all for the Winslows. No surnames, no family history. Stamped and sealed without review. These weren't adoptions, she said. They were vanishings. The paper trails went nowhere. And the kids who stayed, no one ever heard about them again either. Her fingers shook as she pulled out blank fingerprint cards. No IDs, no guardians, just silence wearing a smile. Whispers emerged from retired law enforcement too. One officer claimed there had once been a file labeled W Institute, internal, not for review. No one outside the department ever saw it. It was destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1981. Coincidence, they said. But stories like this rarely end in accidents. By 1938, the Sarah Mitchell in the journal had changed. She wasn't the young nurse following orders. She was something else now, a liability. Her tone sharpened. No longer just documenting events, she was recording patterns. Patterns of disappearance. Patterns of pain. The basement isn't just for supplies, she wrote. I heard screaming again last night. Not the kind from nightmares. The kind children make when they're being hurt. And in the morning, no one speaks of it. She had grown close to a child, Thomas, no older than 6. She mentioned him often, gently, protective. Thomas doesn't sleep anymore, she wrote. He says the man with the needle comes when the halls go quiet. Then came her final entry. It was hurried, slanted, water-damaged, possibly from tears, possibly worse. They know I've seen too much. I heard Henry's voice outside the infirmary. He said, she's not like the others. She'll talk. If anything happens to me, check the East Wing cellar, behind the second wall. Tell the truth for the children. 3 days later, Sarah Mitchell disappeared. There was no missing persons report, no obituary, no goodbye. She was erased like the children she tried to save. If you're still with me, you've already crossed the line between story and secret. The question is, will you keep listening? Because what comes next isn't just about what happened. It's about what still echoes in that forest and what was never meant to be found. The official explanation. She resigned, unexpectedly, left to care for a sick relative, they said. But there was no forwarding address, No train ticket, no letter. Not a single soul saw her leave. Her belongings were packed up quietly by staff. They were never claimed. Sarah Mitchell vanished like smoke from a chimney. Silent. Final. Years later, when the property was sold for demolition, contractors began digging beneath the crumbling east wing. No one thought much of the old foundation until they hit something strange. A second wall, built behind the original cellar. Why, when they cracked it open, Sarah's warnings came alive. Behind that wall, they found a torn child's shoe, blood-stained medical restraints, a filthy bedsheet soaked and buried beneath broken brick. The police report called it a misplaced storage room. Nothing to see here, but the blood tested human, and the restraints were government-issued matching asylum stock from the 1930s. The case was closed in weeks. Sarah's name was scrubbed from the Institute's employee registry. No obituary, no missing person report, no funeral, no family contacted. But the journal survived. Hidden behind a vent in the infirmary nurses' station, it was discovered by a demolition worker in 1985 who, thinking it just a creepy old relic, handed it to a local historian. That one small gesture changed everything. It became the single most damning artifact ever recovered from the Winslow Institute. But by then, it was already far too late. The next discovery came beneath a place meant to inspire peace. The Winslow Chapel. It was the oldest structure on the property, built before the orphanage, before the barbed wire, before the silence. According to blueprints, it was meant to be a sanctuary. Daily hymns, prayers, comfort for lost children. But the truth buried beneath its altar told another story. During minor renovations in the 1980s, workers hit a hollow concrete pocket under the chapel. They thought it was part of an old drainage system. It wasn't. The floor beneath the altar collapsed. And what it revealed made even seasoned forensic agents recoil. A subterranean chamber sealed for decades. Inside, 3 rusted gurneys with cracked leather restraints, dozens of sealed glass jars, some still containing cloudy yellowish fluids, a surgical tray lined with ancient syringes, bone saws, and scalpels. But that wasn't the worst of it. In a trench near the chamber wall were bundled human remains. Children, dozens of them, stacked, wrapped in torn blankets. Some still wore decayed patient gowns. Dental analysis revealed their ages 3 to 11 years old. There were no burial records, no medical files, no names. One wall was lined with a chalkboard, drawn in smudged, fading white anatomical diagrams. Human skulls, nerve clusters, crude spinal structures. Experts later theorized this wasn't a morgue. It was a lab, a secret operating room for unauthorized neurological procedures, conducted on living children. In the basement of a chapel, behind the altar of God. The report labeled historically sensitive and inconclusive. There were no DNA records from the era, no living files to cross-match. So the chamber was sealed again, as if silence could fix it. Tell me, how does a place meant for worship become a tomb? Why would an orphanage need surgical restraints, bone saws, and an underground chamber no blueprint ever showed? And maybe the real question is, Why did no one ever ask where the missing children went? As the investigation into the chapel's chamber deepened, one name kept surfacing. In old prescriptions, in dusty memos, in unsigned medical correspondences, Dr. Edward Halverson. Officially, he was listed as the Winslow Institute's in-house pediatric specialist. But the deeper researchers dug, the less he resembled a healer, and the more he resembled a handler. His license came from Boston in 1906, but red flags were all over it. 1911. Suspended for unauthorized sedation of a child patient. 1914. A child suffered a brain hemorrhage during one of his cognitive tests. The hospital settled quietly. 1917. He disappeared from public medical work, reappearing only as a full-time physician at Winslow. And then nothing. No lectures, no papers, no complaints. But in 1986, a small leather-bound ledger was found locked inside a sealed cabinet beneath the chapel. It bore his signature. What was inside would rewrite everything. The entries were meticulous, cold, technical, calculated. Subject Nanshaw 14, male, age 9. Repeated sedation ineffective. Proceeded with lumbar exposure. Reflexes sluggish. Procedure halted after seizure. Another subject number 21. Female. Age 6. Resisted entry to calm room. Restrained. Whispered about voices in the hallway. Claims to see the twins. Increased morphine dosage. Some entries had been scratched out. Others smeared. But all of them pointed to one thing. The Winslow Institute had become a human research lab, one that specialized in breaking children quietly. There are stories that chill us, and then there are stories that indict us. The question now isn't what happened. It's how many people let it happen. Because this wasn't buried by time. It was buried on purpose. And yet, some things still claw their way back to the surface. The ledger recorded 32 procedures. 32 attempts at something no child should ever have endured. No names, only numbers, except 1. Buried between notations on dosage levels and neurological response times, there was a single sentence written in a trembling hand, not like the others. Mary said she doesn't want to forget again. Mary, the only name in the entire book. Pause. Soft breath. Forensic analysts later confirmed. The ink and parchment were consistent with the early 1920s. And handwriting experts, they had no doubts. The passage matched known letters written by Dr. Everett Halverson during his Boston years. But forget what. The text repeatedly referenced strange clinical phrases: response, inhibition, memory, redirection, emotional severance. These weren't treatments, these were trials, psychological surgeries. Decades later, one nurse now in her 90s agreed to speak under condition of anonymity. Her voice dry and shaking, carried a weight that time had not erased. He thought he could wipe it all away, she said, like chalk on a board. Like the pain was just dust. She said no more. Her name remains redacted, hidden away like the children once were. But why would a pediatric neurologist attempt something like this on orphaned children? And who let him? The deeper investigators probed into Dr. Halverson's archives, the more disturbing the picture became. He wasn't a madman, working in the shadows of his own design. No, there was infrastructure, there were resources, and there was funding, substantial funding. The first clue came in the form of faded, half-burnt bank drafts recovered from the southern wing after the 1946 fire. Through forensic restoration, researchers found recurring monthly payments made directly to Halverson from an entity calling itself the Eckhart Medical Foundation. But here's the thing. The foundation didn't exist, not in any legal sense. No staff, no board, no tax records. It was a ghost. When a research team followed the address listed on those records, they discovered something even more unsettling. The foundation's so-called headquarters was actually the former private residence of Silas Eckhart, a powerful industrialist from Boston with known ties to the American Eugenics Society in the 1910s. Some of you might recognize that name. Most of you won't. That was the point. Eckhart's private journals, unearthed decades later, were chilling even by the standards of his era. One line stood out. Those born broken must be corrected or silenced. He funded facilities across Massachusetts with vague names like rehabilitation centers and correctional retreats. Most were shut down after scandal and lawsuits in the 1930s. But Winslow was different. Because Winslow wasn't public. It was private, hidden. Off-grid, no press, no oversight. Just endless silence and children with no names. No families, no paperwork. Perfect subjects. Still, the operation was vast, expensive, coordinated. It required medical-grade equipment, sedatives, restraints, and entire rooms designed for neurological testing. A former shipping clerk, Jonas Tully, gave a sworn deposition in 1986, just weeks before his death. In it, he described hauling crates labeled Winslow, South Wing, from a warehouse in Boston. They told me it was educational supplies, he said, but it rattled, like glass vials inside, and then, with a pause that shook the tape recorder. One time I saw a man in surgical gear loading head caps with wires. Tully had been paid in cash, no receipts. 3 more witnesses, 2 drivers and a retired pharmacist offered eerily similar accounts. Night deliveries, chemical shipments, odd requests, no questions asked. Why would a children's orphanage need neurological harnesses, chloroform and surgical beds? The answer maybe lies in a rare 1913 pamphlet printed by the Eckhart Medical Foundation, now nearly impossible to find. Its stated mission to develop methods that cleanse the human mind of dysfunction, not through care, but through courage. These weren't experiments. They were procedures, and someone, perhaps many, someone's wanted them carried out in silence. But then came something unexpected. A witness, not a nurse, not a worker, but a guest. In the spring of 1922, a woman named Margaret Elwood, widow of a Pennsylvania state senator, attended a formal dinner at the Winslow estate. She was 34, polished, respected. One of many philanthropic donors whose name was quietly attached to the institute. The evening was lovely, by all outward appearances. Linen napkins, a string quartet, reserved young girls in identical uniforms serving the meal. Halverson even gave a short speech about unlocking the frontiers of the psychological self. But later that night, Margaret slipped away from the tour, and what she saw, she never forgot. Not ever. She didn't speak of it not for 4 decades, but in 1964, dying of pneumonia, she whispered something to her granddaughter. Words that haunted the family for generations until her journals were uncovered long after her death. They showed me children, but not the kind you care for, the kind you study. At the time, no one knew what she meant. The dinner had seemed routine, but Margaret had wandered into a hallway just for a moment. Just long enough to glimpse what lay behind a door someone had forgotten to fully close. What do you think she saw behind that door? Take a deep breath. Because in the next chapter, we'll follow Margaret's footsteps down that hallway into what was supposed to be a recovery ward. But what she described was something else entirely. Stay with us. You're listening to Sleepy History Tales. Through the narrow glass slit in that door, Margaret saw something that would haunt her until the end of her days. Behind it stretched a row of sterile observation chambers, rooms cloaked in an unnatural silence. Pale children lay strapped to beds, unmoving. Wires trailed from their temples, disappearing into brass consoles. Metal braces locked around their heads like medieval vices. Some stared listlessly at the ceiling, eyes vacant as if their souls had been siphoned away. Others shook soft rhythmic tremors that seemed to match a distant pulsing sound. Not music, not even machinery. Something electrical, mechanical, alive. Before Margaret could step closer, a nurse appeared. No words, just a gentle, urgent grip on her arm. She was guided out with a practiced softness. And that was it. Margaret never returned. She severed all ties, cancelled her funding, burned every letter the Institute ever sent her. But she told no one, not the police, not the press, not even her own congregation. Now why? Well, her granddaughter offered a single clue in a 1998 interview. Margaret had once confided that the Winslow family had friends in places too high to touch. And when you look at the guest list from that gala dinner she'd attended, it makes you shiver. Names from Harvard Medical School, Massachusetts, General Hospital, the Eugenics Records Office, even federal officials linked to the early mental hygiene movement. These were people who could bury a scandal before ink hit paper. People who didn't just overlook the expendable, they defined who was expendable. To them, reputations came first. Children collateral. It wasn't until years later, after Sarah Mitchell's journal came to light and Tully's testimony shook the foundation, that Margaret's silence began to make a tragic kind of sense. She hadn't walked into an orphanage. She'd walked into a laboratory. And those weren't students in beds. They were specimens. The mystery deepened in 2005 when the Massachusetts Historical Society acquired the original blueprints of the Winslow Institute. That's when the lies began to unravel. According to state records, the building was simple. A U-shaped red brick structure with 3 floors and a cellar. But the blueprints from 1910 told another story. Beneath the east wing was an unmarked level. No stairs, no elevators, no official access. Just a thick-walled subterranean chamber. It was labeled faintly in fading ink, SW expansion, research access only. Now, let that sink in for a moment. No staff ever spoke of it. No child had ever mentioned it. The state never acknowledged it. So what was this space, and why had it been kept secret for over a century? A retired architect named Edward Cleary was the first to publicly raise the alarm. He'd been hired to assess the building before its proposed conversion into a heritage museum. But the moment he reviewed the blueprints, his gut clenched. "You don't build something like that," he said in a later interview, "unless you're trying to keep something in or something out." Cleary described a feature most wouldn't have noticed: a network of narrow conduits snaking from that sealed floor all the way to the attic of the chapel above. These weren't pipes, not for plumbing, not for air, just wide enough for sound. Some believed these conduits allowed staff to monitor the children from above. Others whispered a more chilling theory that sounds from the chapel. Chants, hymns, sermons were funneled downward into the research chamber. A grotesque experiment in spiritual conditioning. We now know no state inspector was ever granted access to the SW expansion. All inspections ended neatly at the ground floor. All public tours avoided the east wing. And yet, one boy remembered it. In a 1977 group therapy session, a grown man identified only as Frankie M. described a recurring dream he'd had since the age of 6. "There's a hallway," he whispered. "No lights, just humming. Not from a machine, from a throat." In the dream, he would walk toward the sound until he reached a door. Metal. Cold. Always cold. Years later, someone showed Frankie a copy of the 1910 floor plan. He pointed straight at the SW expansion and whispered, "That's the hallway." 50 years later, the memory and the sound still clung to him. And then came the case of William Trevors. In 1962, Trevors, 41 years old, a meticulous no-nonsense state building inspector, was assigned a routine compliance audit of the Winslow Institute. At the time, new child welfare regulations had begun tightening their grip on older institutions. Trevors, a stickler for protocol, arrived early, clipboard in hand, briefcase neatly packed, determined to do things by the book. He never came home. State records confirm he checked in at 8:14 a.m. A staffer saw him being escorted by none other than Elena Winslow herself, an unusual sight, given she rarely dealt with outsiders directly. And then he vanished. By 7:00 p.m., his wife filed a missing persons report. The state responded with a shrug. The institute claimed he'd left early due to a family emergency. They even submitted a visitor log. But the signature, forgery. The handwriting didn't match his. It took 3 weeks of pressure from Trevor's wife and a nosy local newspaper before authorities took real action. By then, of course, the trail was cold. His briefcase was never found. The official explanation? A voluntary disappearance. They said T. Alcott had cracked under personal stress. Maybe infidelity, maybe burnout. Case closed. But there was no proof of any of that. Just silence. Until 1984, nearly 2 decades later, when something surfaced. Something strange. In a dusty, long-abandoned postal hub in Boston, a forgotten mail bin was being cleared out ahead of demolition. Inside, workers found a single, unopened envelope, yellowed with age, stamped T. Alcott, State Records, urgent. It had never been delivered. Inside was a photocopied blueprint of the Winslow Institute sections circled in red ink, and at the bottom, a hastily scribbled note in a shaky, panicked hand. "There's a room they say doesn't exist. I heard something down there. Screaming. Not human. WT. No full name, just initials. WT. The letter was quietly shelved by the state. But that same year, someone else came forward. Gilbert Parks, a 74-year-old former janitor at Winslow dying of emphysema, made a confession. He said he remembered the day Trevor's Alcott arrived. And more importantly, he remembered where he went, not to the East Wing as the file stated. Parks claimed he saw Trevor's led into a locked service elevator, one Parks himself had never once been allowed to use in over a decade of cleaning that facility. When he asked Elanina Winslow about it, she told him it was inventory protocol. He never asked again. Not until he was dying. And the theory, Trevor's Alcott found the sublevel. Or tried to. Maybe he tried to help someone. Maybe he tried to stop something. Whatever happened, he vanished. No grave, no death certificate, no closure. Just a man swallowed by the belly of a building. Now, dear listener, what comes next is the testimony of the only known staff member to escape the Winslow Institute with her life and her conscience still intact. Her name was Clara Ara Montreux. In 1961, Clara was 23, idealistic and freshly certified as a night nurse. She was drawn to the Winslow Institute by promises of noble purpose caring for abandoned children. What could be more honorable? But what she found inside haunted her for the rest of her life. She was assigned to the lower wards, not by choice. New nurses were always sent there first. No one ever lasted long. The corridors were eerily silent, unmarked, too sterile. Children weren't allowed to roam, not even between rooms. Yet Clara said she often heard footsteps, light ones, bare feet moving behind locked doors when no one was supposed to be on shift. In her third week, a boy, maybe 10 years old, head-shaved with strange scarring behind his left ear, slipped a crumpled note into her coat pocket. No one saw. He didn't say a word. The note said, "Don't go below." That same night, Clara was summoned by a senior matron. She was to deliver medicine to Sublevel E, a place she had never even heard of. The elevator ride required a key override. The doors opened to a concrete corridor, cold, silent smelling of bleach, rusted metal, and something worse wrought beneath the disinfectant. The walls were unpainted. No names, no signs. Only faint arrows on the floor leading her past rooms, bolted shut from the outside. In one room, she heard a deep groaning. In another, a soft whimper. Then a man's voice, speaking a language she couldn't recognize. And finally, she reached the surgical theater. It was not abandoned. A man in white stood over a table. He wore a cloth mask. A child's leg was strapped down. Still, pale. Clara dropped the tray. She didn't scream. She didn't ask questions. She just ran. She left her coat, her records, her ID. She didn't even go back to collect her pay. At 2:17 a.m., she fled through the woods behind the compound. She never looked back. The police didn't believe her. Her family told her to forget it. And so she disappeared, moved to northern Maine, never worked in medicine again, never married. But before she died in 2003, Clara left behind a cassette tape. In it, her voice cracked and whispering offered one chilling line. They weren't healing the children down there. They were changing them. Her ashes were scattered in the woods. No obituary. Just a lost tape and a question that would not die. Because after Clara's escape, after her hidden confession, the one question no one could answer came roaring back. Where did all the children go? The Institute's official records at first glance seemed clean. Hundreds of adoptions throughout the 1950s and 60s. Children leaving in groups, usually around age 8 or 9. Adopted the files claimed by families from across the country. Mostly wealthy, mostly white, but the paperwork odd, gaps in dates, signatures that didn't match, custody transfers that skipped legal steps. Some families had no record of ever existing, and in some cases, when reporters tried to follow up, the trail just went cold. And that sleepy history listener is where we turn next. Because paper trails have ghosts too. And the names that pop up again and again in those adoption files. They belong to men and women with connections far beyond the walls of an orphanage. Stay with us. There were no home visits, no follow-up reports, no official case files. No child ever made it into the National Adoption Registry. They simply vanished without a sound, without a trace. In 1958, Boston journalist Richard Hanley uncovered a deeply buried letter. It had been sent from the Winslow Institute's board to the Massachusetts Department of Welfare. The language was vague but chilling private relocation services for unplaceable wards. The letter bore the signature and wax seal of none other than Dr. Everett Winslow himself. But this wasn't adoption. It was outsourcing. Children who had no known relatives, those who struggled in school, who were labeled as problematic, or who had minor behavioral issues were quietly moved. Moved where Hanley began digging. What he uncovered still haunts many to this day. He tracked down 17 families who had submitted formal inquiries to adopt through Winslow between 1954 and 1962. Not a single one ever received a child. Most met a liaison once in a hotel lobby or downtown cafe. After that, nothing. No callbacks, no explanation. No child. So, where did those children go? A clue surfaced in the obituary of a renowned New York surgeon in 1972. Among his listed survivors, adopted son Michael Winslow. That last name wasn't coincidence. Digging deeper, Hanley obtained a birth certificate. Michael had been born at the Winslow Institute in 1950, listed only as unclaimed male infant. His adoption was recorded 5 years later, but his medical records were sealed. Even court orders couldn't unlock them. By the late 1970s, whispers began circulating through private medical circles. Hospitals quietly referenced anonymous test subjects used in drug trials and surgical demos subjects described as young, compliant, and institutionalized. Some were traced back to Winslow. Others were never traced at all. The patterns were grotesquely precise. Unlicensed surgeries, bone marrow extractions, dental implants in children under 5. This wasn't adoption, it was distribution. These children weren't going to loving homes. They were being assigned to influential clients, to benefactors whose interest in a child had nothing to do with family. Winslow made it all look like charity. The logistics were airtight. Doctors signed non-disclosure waivers. Names were altered. Hair was cut. And within the span of an hour, a child's entire identity, their past, their existence was erased. Some of those children may still be alive today. But if they are, they have no idea where they came from. No idea what was done to them. One of them began to remember. Her name was Anna Whitmore. Or at least, that's what she had always believed. Until her mid-30s, Anna thought she'd been adopted from a Catholic orphanage in rural Maine. Her childhood was fractured, a distant father, a cold, severe mother, and a lifelong battle with night terrors. Recurring dreams of grey hallways, metal tables, the smell of antiseptic and something else, coppery like blood. But something never added up. Her records were strangely incomplete. No baptismal certificate, no official adoption file, just a grainy photocopy of a letterhead, Winslow Institute, a name she'd never seen before, until 1991. That year, Anna stumbled across a Boston Globe article, an expose on Winslow's forgotten children. She vomited on the spot. It wasn't fear, she said later in a taped interview. It was memory. She reached out to the journalist who wrote the piece, who then connected her with a retired clerk who had helped archive remaining files from Winslow's shutdown in 1964. Most of the files had been destroyed in a flood, but one fragile water-stained ledger had survived. It contained names of children relocated between 1958 and 1964, and there it was, infant female Whitmore. No first name, no date of adoption, just an assignment code. Anna Whitmore was never her real name. It had been given to her. The memories returned slowly, first in dreams, then in quiet flashes during the day, a red light in her eye, metal wires on her chest, a man whispering instructions to someone standing just out of sight. She thought they were hallucinations, the residue of childhood trauma, but a trauma specialist she consulted disagreed. This isn't madness, they told her. It's memory. Suppressed trauma resurfaces in fragments. It protects the mind until it's ready. Encouraged by a friend, Anna began regression therapy. During one session, she curled up into a fetal position and whispered a phrase again and again. I did good. I didn't scream. He said, I did good. Then came the drawing. With the hand of a child trapped in an adult body, Anna scrawled an image. A white building, iron fences, a black door, and on the door, a strange symbol, a circle with a cross inside. Her therapist stared in disbelief. It was the old emblem of the Winslow Institute. What came next would shatter everything. Anna's therapist, now deeply unsettled, contacted a private investigative group. Because whatever Anna had been through, she wasn't the only one. Coming up next in our story on Sleepy History Tales, what the investigators uncovered next is beyond disturbing and raises questions about how many others like Anna might be out there, still living, still unaware, still haunted. Stay with us. This is far from over. They confirmed that the building in Anna's drawing had indeed once stood on the Winslow property, an auxiliary hall of the East Wing reduced to cinders in a fire back in 1974. But what chilled the bones of the investigators wasn't just her eerie accuracy. It was the impossibility of it. Anna had never seen a photo of the building, not in a book, not in a file. And yet, the angles, the architecture, every detail matched. And then came the DNA match. Archived blood work revealed that Anna's biological mother was none other than Clara Montroe, the same Clara who had escaped the Winslow Institute in the 1960s. Somehow, Anna had been born inside the institute, years after Clara vanished. She was a child of Winslow's long-forgotten program, But here's the thing, dear listener, Anna was not alone. For decades, the Winslow Institute was presented as a simple childcare facility. Its public face, a sterile grey-bricked building surrounded by iron fencing housing dormitories, classrooms, and office space. But in hushed tones, the locals of Harris Township would speak of something else, something beneath. And then, in 1997, those whispers became proof. During demolition of the ruined East Wing, workers clearing rubble from the sub-basement struck something a false wall. Behind it, a narrow corridor, and at the end, a heavy iron door, bolted shut from the inside. Behind that door, a hidden chamber that history never meant to reveal. It was the underground birthing wing. 6 windowless rooms lined with stainless steel tables, restraints bolted into walls, harsh surgical lights, and deep, rusted sinks. The air was foul, undisturbed since the early 60s, saturated with rot and long-buried screams. At the end of the hall, a delivery suite. On the table still mounted were the stirrups. A rust-covered tray of instruments sat untouched, and above a camera affixed to the ceiling, watching. A cabinet nearby held dozens of VHS tapes. Most had degraded, warped by time and humidity, but just a few were salvageable. Investigators played them. What they saw broke even the most hardened among them. Girls, some no older than 13, lay dazed, their expressions vacant. Silent births carried out under the cold hands of masked nurses who moved with mechanical efficiency. No voices, no comfort, no names. The infants taken immediately. Not to be held, but to be measured, weighed, photographed, numbered. Most never saw their mothers again. And these nurses, they didn't belong to any hospital. Their uniforms bore insignias from private medical corps. But payroll and licensing records, empty, scrubbed, as if they never existed. Forensics swept the wing. In a locked drawer, they discovered ID tags, each linked to a mother and a date. Many matched known missing persons cases, but some bore red ink letters, I for adopted, T for test subject, M for medical disposal. And carved deep into the underside of the steel birthing table, someone had scratched a final, devastating plea. If I scream, my baby dies. The story exploded across national headlines. But within 48 hours, the government moved in. The wing was declared structurally unsound. Access was denied. Records redacted. Files vanished. But the truth was already loose. And that's when the whistleblowers began to speak. The first, an old man in a threadbare coat, a heavy leather case in his hand. He walked into the newsroom of a Boston paper and said only, I was there when it started. I know what they did. His name was Dr. Evan Callister. In 1959, he was fresh out of medical school, hired as a junior research assistant under something called the Emmer Program, a supposed philanthropic branch of the Department of Health. But what they were doing at Winslow had nothing to do with public health. According to Callister, Winslow had 2 faces. Above ground, it operated as an orphanage, a sanctuary they claimed for unwanted children from rural families and unwed mothers. But below ground was where the real work happened. Infants born on-site or trafficked in through fake adoption agencies became test subjects. Not volunteers, not patients. Subjects. And the experiments chilling. Callister described controlled sensory deprivation, altered nutrition regimens, isolation to monitor emotional resilience, even non-therapeutic surgeries performed with no post-op care. The goal wasn't to heal, it was to measure, to push, to see what would break and what would evolve. And if you think this couldn't get darker, dear listener, we haven't reached the bottom yet. They weren't measured for growth or health or happiness. They were measured for profitability. Every child at Winslow bore a tag. Some were adopted by wealthy clients not to raise, not to love, but for private medical use. Organ testing, blood compatibility trials, quiet disposable donors. Others were placed into long-term isolation units, tiny sterile rooms observed through one-way glass. Dr. Callister remembered one in particular, case J47. A baby girl left in a soundproof crib for nearly a full year. No touch, no voice, just silence. Her developmental data was obsessively recorded, and when she stopped responding altogether, she was removed. Callister never saw her again, but the moment that broke him came later. A nurse collapsed on the floor one evening after discovering that a test subject meant to be aborted had somehow survived the procedure. The infant was breathing, alive, but protocol was strict. The nurse smothered the child, recorded the birth as stillborn, and the work continued. We were told not to feel, Callister said, that it was for science. But I heard babies crying at night. I still do. He turned over what he had, dozens of aging files, research logs, partial blueprints of the facility. Most of it too damaged to hold up in court, but every fragment matched what investigators had already found. And then, just like in 1960, Callister disappeared. No trace. Some say he fled. Others believe he was silenced. But the damage was done. Investigators now had grounds to access the Winslow Archives, a sealed records vault beneath the East Wing. And what they found wasn't chaos. It was order. Cold, methodical, organized evil. Rows upon rows of cabinets, neatly labeled, chronologically arranged. It didn't resemble a horror scene, it looked like the archive of a prestigious medical university. Everything was catalogued. Case files dating back to 1919 documented Winslow's first research groups, orphans brought in for social betterment. Notes included birth origins, behavioral reactions, and medical interventions. Some files were stamped untraceable, meaning no family, no guardians, no questions. One folder batch, 37 long-term viability study, tracked children ages 3 to 7 relocated from Mississippi and Georgia between 1947 and 1949. Their progress measured by height, weight, and something called emotional durability after isolative exposure. In other words, they were testing how long a child could survive without love. Elsewhere in the archive were letters, correspondence between Winslow directors and unnamed contributors. Some bore government seals. Others were from elite universities. But the most chilling were red-stamped confidential and traced back to military and federal health agencies. A hidden drawer revealed bound client logs, names, addresses, cryptic entries. 3 infants delivered for behavioral tracking, approved trophor for cardiac study, donor-matched blood group, use private, return denied. Winslow's accounting records told the rest. Wealthy clients, many with no oversight, paid staggering sums for custom adoptions. Some were desperate for a child. Others simply wanted one they could control. Some clients were even former psychiatric patients quietly granted access to children without any legal check. Between 1920 and 1965, investigators estimate over 3,000 children passed through Winslow's internal system. Most were never registered, never adopted, never seen again. And while it was the testimony that started the case, it was this paper trail, emotionless, bureaucratic, that built the prosecution. Every stamp, every file, every transaction. Undeniable, but it was the photographs that shattered even the strongest agents. Dozens of black and white images, some clinical, some candid. Blank-faced children, strapped to gurneys, alone in barren rooms. A few were smiling, unaware of the nightmare they lived in. Winslow's archives weren't just evidence, they were a confession. And then the trail widened. Financial records were cross-checked against federal funding. What once seemed like a private scandal now exposed something much larger. Between 1940 and 1965, Winslow received $3.4 million in government grants, adjusted for today's currency over $35 million. But almost none of it was labeled for childcare or education. Instead, funds were marked for behavioral viability studies, rural youth samples, controlled environment development, Type C facilities, end-of-life psychological processing. The terms were sterile, technical, meaningless to outsiders. But retired federal employees confirmed these were euphemisms crafted to hide the truth. The US government had funded experiments on undocumented children. Declassified files from what was then the Department of Health, Education and Welfare confirmed Winslow was categorized as a Category C medical institution, a designation that allowed operations with almost no oversight. In other words, a legal gray zone. Among the many names unearthed, one stood out: Dr. Irving Clemens, a military psychiatrist linked to Cold War projects under the codename Quiet Home. This initiative, like many hidden during the 1950s, focused on emotional control, memory suppression, and behavioral predictability. And according to testimony, Winslow was the perfect testing ground. Clemens visited at least 11 times. His private notes, uncovered years later, referred to Winslow as a compliant ecosystem for long-term behavioral conditioning. Most children show signs of cognitive flattening by day 32, identity loss by day 60. This site is optimal, but it didn't end there. Investigators found financial links to elite East Coast universities, medical schools that had subcontracted Winslow for case material, which decoded meant children for research. Some universities even sent fellows to observe children as part of psychiatric training programs. By the time the network was fully mapped, many involved were dead, retired, or untraceable. Some claimed ignorance. But the evidence was undeniable. The checks had been signed. The funds had flowed. The children had vanished. This wasn't neglect. It wasn't oversight. This was a systemic betrayal by doctors, by scientists, by officials who traded ethics for ambition and humanity for data. Winslow didn't survive in the shadows by accident. It thrived because those in power chose to look the other way. But finally, something surfaced. Something no file, no ledger, no logbook could explain away. It began with a gardener. He was laying irrigation lines in the south garden, once a peaceful lawn, for picnics and Sunday visits. As he drove his spade into the soil, it hit something hard. At first, they thought it was a pipe, a root. It wasn't. He unearthed a small wooden box no larger than a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in decaying linen, were tiny human bones. An infant, authorities were called. Forensic teams arrived. And as they began to dig, the ground started to give up its final secret. Over the next 6 weeks, beneath that quiet garden, they uncovered 43 burial sites, each holding the remains of 1 to 3 children. Some had scraps of fabric, initials stitched with loving hands. Others had nothing at all. 3:17 a.m., and the child in frame was no older than 5. His eyes were half-closed, mouth slack, and his wrists bore faint impressions of restraints. A nurse stood just outside the frame, clipboard in hand, her face turned slightly, as if aware she was being captured. The photo was chilling, not because of what it showed, but because of what it implied, that the experiments happened at all hours, in secret, beyond regulation, beyond mercy. The undeveloped photos were eventually processed by a forensic imaging lab. Among them, stark images of surgical prep trays, blood-streaked gowns tossed into bins, and worst of all, a series labeled only by numbers. Children laid out on exam tables unconscious or deceased, their identities known only by the file tags affixed to their ankles. Several shots appeared to have been taken in haste angles, skewed motion blurred, possibly by Milson himself, documenting what he feared no one would believe. Mara Tinsley's expose, The Quiet Ones, ignited a second firestorm. While much of the photographic evidence could not be aired due to its graphic nature and legal challenges from former board members, enough was verified by experts and matched to existing Winslow logs that the truth became undeniable. This wasn't an isolated facility gone rogue. This was an entire infrastructure, a web of collusion between state science and industry, carefully designed to remain hidden. One of the last labeled reels included a 40-second clip with no audio. It shows a girl, maybe 6 years old, walking down a dimly lit corridor flanked by 2 adults. She pauses, looks directly at the camera, and smiles weakly, as if she recognized whoever was behind it. A placard hung from her neck, J46. That moment, frozen in footage, would become the haunting symbol of Winslow's legacy. A child halfway between resistance and resignation, walking willingly into the unknown because she had no choice. The Winslow Institute investigation, now considered one of the most far-reaching child abuse cases in American history, resulted in dozens of sealed indictments, several high-profile resignations, and the collapse of at least 2 biomedical firms. But many argue justice was never truly served. Too many perpetrators were dead, too many records destroyed, too many children still missing. But survivors, investigators, and journalists like Tinsley ensured one thing: the truth would never be buried again. Winslow had been a house of silence. Now it was a name that could never be spoken without shuddering. Soft ambient music fades in slightly melancholic, distant echoes of wind. Welcome back, dear listeners. Tonight's story grows darker and deeper. And if you've been with us this far, you're already braver than most. We now return to the story of the Winslow Institute, to the evidence that could no longer be denied. The photograph was faded, slightly curled at the edges, but what it captured was unmistakable. A boy no older than 9 lay on a cold metal table, His eyes were open, but vacant, unfocused. Hovering just beside him was a gloved hand holding a small metallic instrument. No labels, no names, no explanations. But investigators would later confirm the setting: the subfloor of the Winslow main building, a space long denied to even exist. Blueprints found among Edgar Milson's personal files finally exposed its reality. A floor labeled with only 2 chilling words: wing restrictor. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Several former residents, now elderly, had once whispered of a freezing room, one where time seemed to stop. They were told it was a dream, a nightmare born from trauma. But now, standing before these physical blueprints, it was clear it hadn't been a dream. It had been real. The most haunting piece of evidence wasn't a photograph. It was a sound. An old cassette barely holding together, discovered in a tangle of wires Milson left behind. The audio starts with static then. A voice. Clear. Calm. Cold. Increased dosage on group 2B. Note elevated heart rate in 3 or 4. Restrain until compliant. Then, silence. Listeners take a deep breath. This wasn't folklore. This was not speculation. These were the walls of the Winslow fortress, cracking not from force, but from truth, from proof. In 1978, a financial auditor named Danielle Evely was brought in to investigate a series of quietly funded government programs. One in particular stood out: the Winslow Institute for Child Advancement. It wasn't the name that caught his attention, it was the numbers. Over a 10-year span, the institute had received millions in grants, far more than required for a school its size. The expenditures: vague medical upgrades, private educational pilots, international consultations, but no results, no published studies, no success stories, just a black hole of money and silence. Evely's curiosity turned into obsession. What he uncovered shook even hardened investigators. Winslow's money wasn't just federal. It came from private hands, powerful ones. Names like judges, senators, executives, and clergy donating large sums through offshore charities. One in Canada, another in Ireland, both later linked to defunct child relocation programs. Then came the document that Evely would never forget: a 1969 invoice stamped and signed billed to the Winslow Medical Expansion Fund. It listed the purchase of 14 reinforced restraint chairs, biometric monitoring units, sensory deprivation chambers sized specifically for children, and the supplier A military contractor, typically used for overseas interrogations. Evely turned over everything. Within weeks, his office was shut down, his report sealed. Years later, during a closed-door inquiry, he would say, "They told me I was risking national stability." And I asked, whose nation? Whose stability? Because it sure wasn't for the children locked in that building. As more documents surfaced, so did darker truths. One former administrator speaking under protection from abroad admitted that some children were quietly transferred to private families, primarily in Europe and the Middle East, but not through adoption. There were no legal records, no follow-up. Terms appeared in donation letters, terms like preferred subjects, specific conditions, and behavioral samples. Listeners, these weren't homes. These were orders. And here's the hardest part to hear. Many of those children were never legally listed as missing because officially they never existed. By the early 1980s, the whispers had grown into warnings, and a few brave souls, nurses, social workers, even clergy, risked everything to speak. One was Grace Holley, a pediatric nurse in 1974. In a letter to her representative, she wrote, "The children are drugged. Sometimes for hours. I've seen restraint marks. I treated a boy once who seemed barely conscious. These aren't orphans. They're experiments." Grace's letter vanished. 3 weeks later, her apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen except her handwritten notes. Another voice belonged to Father Martin Dwyer, a Jesuit priest sent to Winslow for spiritual support. What he found, he said, wasn't sin. It was evil. He tried to report it. He never made it. His car was found upside down in a ravine. The cause, brake failure. But records show the car had just been serviced. Then came Teresa Keller, a young reporter from a small paper. Her article, "What's Really Behind the Winslow Smile?" barely made headlines until she was fired 3 weeks later. Reason fabricated sources. Her editor later admitted, "I was pressured from people far above my pay grade. Each voice that spoke was silenced, discredited, institutionalized, or simply vanished." The most chilling, a man known only as Daniel W., a senior Winslow staffer who contacted a human rights group in Boston. On tape, he said, "They keep the real files inside the chapel. Under the altar there's a hatch, tapes, photos, names. I've seen them. If they find out I told you this, I won't see next week." 2 days later, he was found dead. Cause of death, suicide by gunshot. The gun was never found. But then, the silence broke. Not by a government agency, not by the FBI, but by 3 strangers, 3 grieving mothers. Margaret Bell, retired teacher. Alma Jennings, a postal clerk. Sister Claire Donovan, a nun-turned-advocate. None had legal authority. But they had something stronger proof. They uncovered forged records, falsified adoption trails, and one name that kept appearing Winslow. Together they formed Mothers of the Missing. Mocked, threatened, dismissed, until a man named Robert Cleary, a former janitor, agreed to testify. He described a second sealed sub-level beneath the Winslow Chapel, behind fake walls, beneath storage rooms. There, he said, were surgical trays, boxes marked medical disposal, a door with a keypad, and folders marked non-returnable subjects. Armed with his testimony, the state acted. In 1991, under the guise of a health inspection, officials raided the chapel basement. What they found was beyond anything they'd imagined. 4 surgical tables, expired anesthesia vials, children's shoes, coats, tags with numbers instead of names, and in the corner, an incinerator. Not a myth, not a rumor, a crime scene. The local headline read, "The Winslow Mass." The national ones followed. Dear listener, take a moment to breathe. Let this settle, because next time on Sleepy History Tales, we go even deeper into what the government knew, into who funded the cover-ups, and into the last living witness still trying to tell the truth. You've been listening to Sleepy History Tales. If you've made it this far, you already carry the truth. Now, share it. Until next time, sleep softly. But don't forget, some history doesn't rest easy. The order to close the Winslow Institute came swiftly. The state moved in with quiet finality, boarding up corridors that had once echoed with the soft shuffle of children's footsteps. And yet, what began as closure soon became an awakening. Survivors began to speak. Families, long haunted by vague adoption records and missing documents, found the courage to ask questions. But the questions only led to more shadows. Because when the investigators opened Winslow's financial records, they didn't find a trail, they found a web. For over 4 decades, the Winslow Institute had been quietly fed by streams of money. Not from local charities or predictable state budgets, but from private sources, powerful, protected, and deeply connected. Medical universities, pharmaceutical giants, tax-shielded trusts, anonymous donations from what appeared to be legacy foundations. But 3 names appeared again and again. The Ulrich Foundation, a philanthropic giant that publicly funded child welfare innovations across the country. Dr. Franklin Ames, hailed in textbooks as a pioneer in neuropsychiatric surgery. And Senator William P. Lell, once the face of mental health reform in the 1950s and 60s. On the surface, these men and their organizations had been revered, praised for building institutions for modernizing the care of abandoned or troubled children. But when fragments of old Winslow logs and nurse journals were cross-referenced against decades of funding records, a darker truth emerged. Dr. Ames, long deceased, had not just advised Winslow, he'd overseen its most disturbing chapter. From 1954 to 1968, his personal memos documented special trials involving children deemed genetically unfit or neurologically deviant. Many of these children were never adopted. Most had no families, no one to file complaints. Ames's handwritten notes, now housed in a sealed section of the state archive, included phrases like, "Cognitive suppression thresholds hold longer in J group. Tolerance under prolonged sedation stable. Non-reactive subjects. Ideal trial set." Meanwhile, the Ulrich Foundation had been funneling millions into innovative pediatric research exclusively through Winslow, with no published findings, no oversight committees, and crucially, no surviving test subjects. And Senator Lell, while promoting mental health access in the public eye, Lell had secured Winslow's long-term protections through a private charter exempting it from federal inspection. It would later be revealed that Lell's family estate held quiet stock in a pharmaceutical firm linked to multiple compounds tested on Winslow's children. At this point, dear listener, the story stopped being about what happened. It became a reckoning of how many knew, how many helped, how many signed off, and how many turned their eyes away while children were hurt in the name of progress. The tragedy of Winslow was not simply in its horrors. It was in the weight of its silence. By the time the legal system began circling, proposing charges, and preparing trials, it was too late. Most of the key figures were dead. Records were shredded. Statutes of limitation had long expired. Others had cleverly hidden behind plausible deniability, pointing fingers at ghosts. And the families, once again, they were left with the same thing: grief, confusion, and that yawning emptiness where answers should have been. But this time, they weren't alone. They came from all over states apart, lives reshaped by years of forgetting. Some had changed their names, some had forgotten their birthdays, others had no memory of Winslow at all, until the images hit the newspapers. And suddenly, things they'd buried began to surface. The first to come forward was Ellen Moore, a retired librarian in Michigan. For most of her life, she'd believed she was adopted from a state-run home at the age of 6. But one morning, she sat at her kitchen table flipping through a Sunday article on the Winslow investigation. And something stopped her cold. The photo showed the wallpaper of a second-floor dormitory, peeling but still vivid. Green ships and cloud patterns, childish, dreamlike. Ellen whispered to her friend, "That wallpaper. I used to trace the ships with my finger before I fell asleep. From there came a cascade of memories. Cold tile floors under bare feet, a nurse in all white holding a clipboard, the sound of metal trays, and a boy named Joseph, who vanished after a special appointment in the basement." For decades, Ellen had dismissed these fragments as childhood nightmares. But now she was certain she had been a Winslow child. And then came another voice from a hospice bed in Nebraska. David Keller, age 71. His story arrived in a letter to a small local newspaper, postmarked just 3 days before he passed. He wrote, "They told us it was a gift to be picked for treatment. They said we were helping the world. But all I remember is the smell of iodine, that bright white light. I was 8. What the hell did they need from me?" A nurse later confirmed that Keller bore a scar across his lower spine, precise, deliberate surgical, too clean for an accident. His records sealed, his past untraceable. But his voice, like Ellen's, had now entered the growing storm of truth. "You're still with us. Take a breath. It's a lot to absorb." Here at Sleepy History Tales, we don't offer sensational answers, but we do bring forward the questions others buried. We remember the names history tried to forget, and we ask you to stay curious even when the answers hurt. There's more to this story, and we'll continue in the next chapter. Are you ready to hear what came next? The Winslow Institute had long surpassed mere wealth. It had something far more dangerous: protection. State social workers flagged irregularities, children vanishing, mid-process files mysteriously empty. But the reports, gone, buried. Complaints poured in to medical boards, unethical procedures, unexplained scarring sedation without consent. Still nothing. No follow-ups. No headlines. A 1964 internal memo from a Chicago public health official warned of experimental methods being conducted on minors within Winslow facilities. The stamp classified. Internal review only. It never reached the press. Meanwhile, financial audits revealed a carefully orchestrated river of donations. Millions funneled from Winslow-affiliated trusts to prestigious universities, medical research labs, even state development councils. Winslow wasn't a lone outlier. It was a pipeline. One that moved data bodies and silence into the hands of those who profited most. And then came the worst of it. A 1971 private transcript surfaced. A closed-door meeting between Winslow directors and state officials. One commissioner's words chilled the bones of every investigator who read them. "If these numbers go public, none of us will survive the fallout. Shut it down quietly. Make sure the paperwork reflects compliance." That man would go on to serve on the National Council for Child Welfare. He died in 2003, never charged, never named. Journalists uncovered travel logs, Senior Winslow staff had attended secretive scientific conferences, Switzerland, Berlin, London, between 1950 and 1972. Their topic, neurodevelopmental disorders in children. Several of those present now sit or once sat on advisory boards of pharmaceutical companies still operating today. This wasn't a local stain. It was a global complicity, a quiet pact of professional courtesy, at the expense of thousands of forgotten children, and perhaps the cruelest crime of all, not the abuse, not the experiments, it was erasure. Some children were declared never born. Others buried under pseudonyms in unmarked graves. Their real names struck from every ledger. Their files wiped. Imagine being a survivor, knowing what happened, living it, then being told, you don't exist. But silence eventually breaks. By 2022, a lawsuit was filed in federal court. It named 29 individuals and 14 institutions, universities, hospitals, agencies. Every one of them had either enabled or turned away from what was happening behind Winslow's walls. For the first time, the truth began to bleed into daylight. But even now, justice remains fragile. And that leads us to the final unflinching question. Why didn't anyone stop it? The signs were never hidden. They were simply ignored. From the 1950s to the 1990s, dozens of reports were filed. Whistleblowers spoke. Nurses warned. Local residents whispered. Anonymous letters arrived. Yet inspections were called off, inquiries dismissed. Winslow operated untouched, unhindered for nearly half a century. Because this wasn't just about cruelty. It was about convenience. Most staff were vulnerable single mothers, immigrants, workers with no legal backing. Speaking out meant risking everything: their jobs, their homes, even custody of their own children. And so, most stayed quiet. Those who did speak up, silenced, labeled unstable, let go quietly. Local officials had their own reasons to look the other way. The Winslow Foundation poured money into schools, parks, scholarships. To question it meant cutting off a generous patron. Winslow was, after all, a point of civic pride, a model orphanage. Who wanted to believe there were ghosts behind its whitewashed walls? Even the media failed. In 1973, a maintenance worker, Gary Lennox, reported reinforced substructures and sealed wings under the institute. He was fired a week later. The newspaper that interviewed him, it pulled the story. Its editor, a past recipient of a Winslow-funded community award. Some children did escape. They tried to tell the truth, but no one believed them. Their trauma was too dark, too large, and perhaps too believable. Many ended up institutionalized, jailed, or lost to the streets. Files missing. Names changed. Their voices too unsettling for a public that wanted to believe it couldn't happen here. But it did. Not because of monsters hiding in shadows, but because too many people looked away. In 2023, the final investigation ended not with a verdict, but with a quiet settlement. No televised trial, no national apology. Compensation, yes, but no true reckoning. A memorial wall was proposed near the grounds where the institute once stood. 3,100 names still unaccounted for. Locals protested. Let the past stay buried, they said. But friends Isn't that what let it grow in the first place? The true horror of Winslow isn't just the crimes, it's the compliance, the complicity, the comfort in pretending not to see. And unless we name it, remember it, teach it, it will return. Maybe not in Pennsylvania, maybe not called Winslow, but somewhere with new names, new victims, new silence. History doesn't bury itself, we do. So tonight as you rest, if you hear footsteps in the halls of forgotten institutions, if you feel the weight of the unspoken, know this: some stories never want to stay buried. This was Sleepy History Tales. And some tales are not meant to help you sleep. They're meant to keep you awake.